The phone call came through at 6 o'clock in the evening on November 23, 2024. On the other end of the line was an 18-year-old British university student, alone in the Bucegi Mountains of Romania, his voice tight with cold and exhaustion. He told the emergency dispatcher he was suffering from hypothermia. He said he was disoriented. He needed help. The dispatcher kept him on the line, tried to pinpoint his location, told him to keep moving, told him not to stop. And then, somewhere high in the Tiganesti Valley, surrounded by snow and fog, and the kind of cold that steals consciousness, George Smyth's phone went silent. Before we continue with George's story, we want to take a moment to connect with the community watching this. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you're interested in stories that honor those we've lost while teaching others about mountain safety, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who might find it meaningful. George's story deserves to be told with respect, and sharing it helps keep his memory alive, while potentially helping others make safer decisions in the mountains. When the mountain rescue teams reached the area where George's phone had last pinged, they found his backpack within hours. Inside were the things a person needs to survive a night in the mountains: a sleeping bag, a tent, food, warm clothes. But George himself had vanished into the vastness of the Carpathians, and as the snow continued to fall and the temperature dropped further below freezing, the window for survival narrowed with each passing hour. This is the story of what happened to George Smyth. It's told not with sensationalism or manufactured drama, but with the care and respect his memory deserves. It's a story about adventure and risk, about mountains that give nothing back, and about a family's grief that will never fully heal. Most importantly, it's a story that carries lessons that could save lives. George Smyth grew up in Newport, Shropshire, in the kind of English town where community means something real. He wasn't just another teenager passing through youth on his way to somewhere else. The people who knew him described him in remarkably consistent terms. Phenomenally kind, they said. Selfless. Fiercely loyal to his friends. Full of energy and enthusiasm for everything he touched. At Newport Salop Rugby Club, George was family. He'd come up through the junior sections, playing with the same boys year after year, forming the kinds of bonds that go deeper than sport. By the time he was playing for the Colts, he wasn't just taking from the club anymore. He was giving back, volunteering his time to coach younger players, passing on what he'd learned to the next generation coming up behind him. His mother, Jo Smyth, would later describe him as a sporty and strong young man who traveled extensively with his family and friends. George loved the mountains. Not in the abstract, romanticized way many people claim to love nature, but in the active, engaged way of someone who sought them out, who wanted to be in them, to test himself against them, to experience the world at elevation where the air is thin and the views stretch for miles. In the autumn of 2024, George began his studies at the University of Bristol. The future looked bright and wide open. He was 18 years old, an age when the world feels both infinitely large and personally conquerable, when invincibility seems like a birthright rather than the illusion it actually is. And so in late November 2024, George made a decision. He would go to Romania. He would hike in the Carpathian Mountains. He would do it alone. And he wouldn't tell his parents beforehand. This wasn't rebellion. It was a young man's attempt to spare his family worry. He knew they would be concerned. He knew they would ask questions about preparation, about routes, about safety measures and contingency plans. So instead of having those conversations, he simply went. Looking back, his family would understand the impulse even as they grieved it. George was adventurous. He was confident in his abilities. And like many young people, he probably didn't fully appreciate how small the margin for error becomes in the mountains, or how quickly conditions can shift from manageable to deadly. To someone scrolling through photographs online, the Bucegi Mountains look stunning. Dramatic peaks rising above forested valleys. Rocky outcroppings that catch the light at sunset. The kind of landscape that calls to adventurers and photographers, and people who want to feel small against something vast and ancient. And the mountains are all of those things. But they're also unforgiving in ways that no photograph can ever capture. The Bucegi Range is part of the Southern Carpathians in Romania. These are old mountains, worn smooth in places by millennia of weather and geological time, but still capable of sudden violence. Peaks rise above 2,000 meters. Slopes can reach angles of 45 degrees or more. The terrain shifts dramatically within the span of a few hours hiking, from dense forest to exposed alpine environment where there's nowhere to hide from the wind. What makes the Bucegi particularly dangerous in November is how rapidly the weather can change. Conditions that seem perfectly manageable in the morning can transform into a fight for survival by afternoon. Fog rolls in without warning, thick and disorienting. Snow accumulates quickly. Wind speeds at altitude can gust beyond 70 miles per hour, turning even modest snowfall into a complete whiteout that erases trails and landmarks and any sense of direction. The temperature drops precipitously after sunset. In late November, the sun goes down around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Once that happens, temperatures at elevation can plummet to -10 degrees Celsius or lower. For someone who's wet from sweat or snow, who's already exhausted from hours of hiking, who might not be adequately prepared for the cold, hypothermia doesn't take days to set in. It takes hours, sometimes less. The survival statistics in these conditions tell a grim story. In the Bucegi Range's recorded history, mountain rescues that extend beyond 72 hours have roughly an 80% success rate when the person is found alive. But after that critical 3-day window passes, survival becomes increasingly unlikely. The human body simply cannot maintain core temperature indefinitely in sub-freezing conditions, especially when wind and moisture and physical exhaustion are compounding the danger. The Bucegi Mountains have claimed lives before. They will claim lives again. This isn't a moral judgment of the mountains or the people who venture into them. It's simply a fact. Mountains are indifferent. They don't care about your experience level, your physical fitness, or your good intentions. They operate according to physics and weather and chance, and the margin for error is razor thin. This is where George Smyth chose to hike. Alone, in late November, without telling anyone his exact route or when to expect him back. We will never know exactly what George's morning looked like on November 23, 2024. We don't know what time he woke up or what he ate for breakfast or what was going through his mind as he prepared for the hike. What we do know is this. He set off from Poiana Brasov, a ski resort area that serves as a common jumping-off point for various trails into the Bucegi Range. His plan, as near as investigators could later reconstruct, was to hike toward the Bran area. This is the region famous for Bran Castle, often called Dracula's Castle because of its tenuous association with Bram Stoker's novel. It's a popular tourist destination, but the route George chose wasn't the well-trodden path to the castle itself. He was heading into the mountains proper, into terrain that gets significantly more remote with every mile. Around 9 o'clock that morning, evidence suggests George passed near the Maliesti Chalet. This detail would later trouble the rescue teams. The chalet offers shelter. It was already growing dark, or at least the light was fading fast. For reasons that will never be fully understood, George didn't stop. He didn't go inside. He continued on into the wilderness. Sebastian Marinescu, director of the Salvamont Brasov Mountain Rescue Service, would later express bewilderment at this decision. It was already dark, he noted in interviews with the press. Why would someone not seek shelter when it's right there, available, and darkness is falling? Perhaps George believed he could make more progress before stopping for the night. Perhaps he felt strong and wanted to push on while he still had energy. Perhaps he misjudged the time remaining or the distance to his next checkpoint. Perhaps he simply didn't realize how quickly the conditions would deteriorate. We don't know. We can only speculate, and speculation doesn't bring anyone back. What we do know with certainty is that George continued into the Taiganesti Valley, one of the more isolated and challenging areas of the Bucegi Range. The valley is vast, covering a large geographic area with numerous ravines, hidden drop-offs, and terrain features that can swallow a person whole. And in November, with snow beginning to accumulate and temperatures dropping by the hour, it becomes exponentially more dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, something began to change for George. Maybe the weather shifted faster than he'd anticipated. Maybe the hiking was more strenuous than he'd expected, and he was burning through his energy reserves. Maybe the cold was seeping into his body faster than he could generate heat through movement. Whatever the specific sequence of events, George was beginning to recognize that he was in serious trouble. He was becoming exhausted in a way that went beyond normal fatigue. The kind of exhaustion where your muscles stop responding quite right, where your thoughts get slower and fuzzier around the edges. He was feeling the cold not as mere discomfort, but as something deeper and more threatening, something that was getting into his bones and his core. His body was losing heat faster than it could produce it, and that equation only goes one direction. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, George made the most important decision of his hike. He called for help. He dialed 112, Romania's emergency number, the equivalent of 911. The call connected to the Salvamont Brașov Mountain Rescue Service. And George, his voice surely tight with cold and fear and the realization of just how badly wrong things had gone, told them he needed help. He was exhausted. He was suffering from hypothermia. He was disoriented, lost in the kind of disorientation where familiar landmarks become strange and your sense of direction abandons you completely. The emergency dispatchers did everything they could over that phone line. They asked for his location, tried to get GPS coordinates from his phone signal, attempted to guide him verbally to safety. They told him to keep moving along the marked trail if he could find one, because movement generates body heat and can delay the onset of severe hypothermia. They told him not to stop moving, not to sit down, absolutely not to fall asleep. They told him help was coming, that rescuers were being mobilized, that he just needed to hang on. And then, shortly after that call began, George Smyth's phone signal died. Mountain rescue teams in Romania operate with the kind of precision that comes from years of experience with terrain that doesn't forgive mistakes. The Salvamont Brașov service is one of several regional mountain rescue organizations that cover the Carpathians, staffed by professionals who understand that in these mountains, minutes matter more than anything else. When George's call came through that evening, the response was immediate. Teams mobilized despite the deteriorating conditions. They gathered their equipment, thermal imaging cameras, search dogs trained specifically for mountain rescue, communications gear, medical supplies, everything they would need for a night search in brutal weather. The conditions they faced were as bad as they get. Wind howling through the valleys. Snow falling so thick it cut visibility to almost nothing. Fog rolling in dense banks that turned familiar terrain into something alien and disorienting. Temperatures that had already dropped well below freezing and were still falling. The kind of weather that makes searching dangerous, not just difficult, but dangerous for the rescuers themselves. But they went anyway. Because that's what mountain rescue teams do. They go into the mountains when conditions are at their worst, because that's precisely when people need them most. They worked through the night, moving carefully through terrain that could kill them as easily as it could kill the person they were searching for. They called George's name into the wind. They swept the areas around where his phone had last pinged with their thermal cameras, looking for any heat signature that might indicate a person. The dogs worked the scent trails as best they could in conditions that made scent work nearly impossible. And then, within hours of beginning the search, they found something. George's backpack. It was located in the Tăiginesti Valley, in roughly the same area where his phone's signal had been detected. The rescuers gathered around it, opened it carefully, and what they found inside made the situation infinitely more confusing and deeply more concerning. The pack was full. A sleeping bag, a tent, food, warm clothes, all the equipment a person would need to survive a night in the mountains, maybe even several nights if they were careful and smart about it. These weren't the belongings of someone unprepared. This was the gear of someone who had done at least some planning, who understood on some level what the mountains required. So why had George left it behind? Sebastian Marinescu, the director of Salvamont Brașov, would later tell reporters that this discovery baffled the entire rescue team. The backpack had quite a lot of equipment in it, he said. A sleeping bag, a tent. My colleagues even found food scattered around. We don't understand what happened and where he could have gone. There are possible explanations, none of them good. One of the documented phenomena in severe hypothermia is something called paradoxical undressing. As the body's core temperature drops into the danger zone, the peripheral blood vessels that have been constricted to preserve core heat suddenly dilate. This creates a sensation of intense warmth, even though the person is actually freezing to death. Victims experiencing this will often remove their clothes, convinced they're overheating when they're actually in the final stages of hypothermia. There's another phenomenon called terminal burrowing or hide-and-die syndrome. In the final stages of hypothermia, some victims experience a primitive impulse to seek small, enclosed spaces. They crawl into caves, under bushes, between rocks. The theory is that this is an autonomous process triggered by the brain stem as consciousness fades, a last desperate attempt by the dying brain to seek shelter. But neither of these behaviors fully explains leaving a backpack full of survival equipment behind and then moving away from it. George had just been on the phone with emergency services. He knew help was coming. He'd been told to keep moving, to stay on the trail, not to fall asleep. Why would he abandon the very things that could keep him alive? Did he panic? Was he more disoriented than his phone call suggested? Did he think he was close to shelter and decided to move faster without the weight? Did something happen that forced him to leave the pack behind? A fall? A sudden physical collapse that made carrying it impossible? The rescuers didn't know. They couldn't know. All they had was a backpack in the snow and no sign of the person it belonged to. The search continued through that night and into the morning. More teams were called in. By the next day, Friday, November 24th, 20 mountain rescuers were actively searching the Taiganesti Valley and the surrounding areas. They covered every accessible section of terrain, following the standard grid patterns that search and rescue teams use to ensure they don't miss anything. They brought in more equipment. Drones equipped with thermal cameras that could scan large areas quickly, looking for heat signatures that might indicate a person. More search dogs. They even deployed a Black Hawk helicopter, a rare resource that speaks to the seriousness of the operation and the difficulty of the terrain. The helicopter could ferry teams quickly to the most remote and inaccessible sections of the massif, areas that would take hours to reach on foot. They searched the ridgelines. They searched the valleys. They searched the forest and the exposed alpine sections. They called George's name until their voices were raw. The dogs worked scent trails through the snow. The thermal cameras scanned thousands of square meters of mountainside. And they found nothing. No tracks that led anywhere useful. No heat signatures. No further belongings. No sign that George had sheltered anywhere in the immediate area. By Saturday, the weather was getting worse. The snow was accumulating faster than the teams could search. In some sections of the valley, the snow depth exceeded 2 meters, deep enough to completely bury a person, deep enough to make movement extremely difficult even for the rescuers in their specialized gear. The Salvamont teams made a decision that must have been agonizing. They climbed higher into the Bucegi Mountains and spent the night at the Maliesti Chalet, the same chalet George had passed without stopping, positioning themselves to resume the search at first light. 17 rescuers bedded down in the cold that night, knowing that with each hour that passed, the likelihood of finding George alive dropped further. On Sunday morning, they went back out into conditions that were deteriorating by the hour. Fresh snow had fallen overnight. The layer of new powder made the already difficult terrain even more treacherous. The rescuers were moving slowly now, carefully, because the risk of avalanche was increasing with every hour of new snowfall. They continued working with George's family to try to reconstruct his exact route, to figure out where he might have gone after leaving his backpack behind. His mother, George Smyth, had flown to Romania as soon as she heard her son was missing. She was working with the rescue coordinators, providing any information she could about George's plans, his experience level, his mindset, trying to piece together the puzzle of where her son might be. On November 28th, 5 days after George's emergency call, the Salvamont Brasov service made a public appeal. They posted George's photograph on Facebook along with a detailed description of when and where he'd gone missing. The family asks us to share the photo of George, the post read. Despite maintained efforts, he has not been located to date, although search operations have been conducted daily, with resources permanently adapted to ground conditions. The appeal asked anyone who might have been in the area, anyone who might have seen George or had any information at all, to come forward immediately. Every piece of information mattered now. A sighting from another hiker, a trail marker he might have mentioned in passing, anything that could narrow the search area or provide a new direction to look. The response from the public was significant. People across Romania and the UK shared the post. News outlets picked up the story. But no new information came in that helped the searchers. No one had seen George after he made that phone call. He had simply vanished into the vastness of the mountains. By early December, the rescue teams were facing an impossible situation. The weather had turned from bad to catastrophic. Severe winds battered the upper elevations. Thick fog reduced visibility to near zero. Heavy snow continued to fall, and the accumulation in the Taiganesti Valley was reaching dangerous levels. The avalanche risk had been raised to level 4, a rating that indicates high danger, where even remote triggering is possible and avalanches can easily be triggered on many steep slopes. For the rescue teams, this meant that continuing the search was no longer just difficult or uncomfortable. It was actively suicidal. They had covered all the accessible areas under safe conditions. They had searched every section of terrain where they could operate without unreasonably endangering their own lives. And they had found nothing beyond George's backpack. On December 1st, the Salvamont-Brasov service made another statement, this one heavy with the weight of a decision no rescue service wants to make. The search operations were suspended again, they wrote. Unfortunately, no objects belonging to George were identified today, nor were any other clues suggesting a possible place where he could have taken shelter. The statement continued with careful, deliberate language. The weather conditions remain extremely difficult. The snow layer is unstable, and assessments indicate a level 4 avalanche risk, which makes it impossible to carry out operations within parameters that do not endanger the lives of the mountain rescuers. In several sectors of the valley, the snow exceeds 2 meters, an aspect also visible in the photomaterials transmitted from the field. Then came the part that mattered most, both to the family and to critics who might question the decision to suspend. Under these conditions, digging and moving in exposed areas would represent an unacceptable risk for the teams involved in the intervention. We would like to emphasize with all clarity and responsibility that this case is not abandoned. Contrary to some rumors that have appeared online, Salvamont-Brasov never abandons an operation and does not give up on any missing person, regardless of nationality or how the accident occurred. The suspension, they stressed, was temporary. Once the weather stabilized and the snow cover reduced, the searches would resume. During the winter, patrol activities would continue in the area, and if any new information came to light, teams would respond immediately. But the unspoken reality hung over everything. George Smyth had been missing for more than a week at that point. He had been suffering from hypothermia when he made his emergency call. He had been exhausted and disoriented. He had left behind the equipment that could have kept him alive. And the conditions in the mountains since that phone call had been consistently brutal. Freezing temperatures every night, wind, snow, fog. The survival window had closed. The human body is remarkably resilient in many ways, but it has hard limits when it comes to cold. Understanding what happens to a person experiencing severe hypothermia helps explain both the behaviors the rescuers observed and why the survival window closed so quickly for George. Hypothermia is defined as a core body temperature below 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The progression happens in stages, each more dangerous than the last. In the first stage, mild hypothermia, the body's response is straightforward and functional. Shivering begins almost immediately. This is the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. Blood vessels in the extremities constrict, redirecting blood flow to the core to protect vital organs. The person remains conscious and alert, though they feel cold and uncomfortable. Mental function is still largely intact. As the core temperature continues to drop into moderate hypothermia, things begin to change in more troubling ways. Shivering becomes violent and uncontrollable, burning through the body's energy reserves at an unsustainable rate. Then, paradoxically, the shivering stops altogether. This isn't because the person is warming up. It's because the muscles responsible for shivering have become exhausted and can no longer function. Mental confusion sets in. Judgment becomes impaired. The person may become lethargic or disoriented. They might make poor decisions, like removing layers of clothing or wandering away from shelter. Severe hypothermia is where the truly bizarre and terrifying symptoms emerge. At this stage, the core temperature has dropped below 28 degrees Celsius. The person may lose consciousness, heart rate, and breathing slow to dangerously low levels. Cardiac arrest becomes a real and immediate risk. But before unconsciousness takes hold, two phenomena can occur that seem to defy logic and reason. The first is called paradoxical undressing. Research has documented this in approximately 25% of hypothermia deaths. As the body's core temperature plummets, the muscles that have been constricting the peripheral blood vessels, forcing blood to stay in the core, become so exhausted they suddenly relax and fail. When this happens, warm blood from the core rushes out to the extremities all at once. The victim experiences this as an intense sensation of heat, almost like a hot flash. They feel like they're burning up, overheating, even though their core temperature is actually in the deadly range. Combined with the severe mental confusion and disorientation that accompanies this stage of hypothermia, the victim often responds by removing their clothes. They strip off jackets, pants, shirts, convinced they need to cool down. In their altered mental state, this makes perfect sense. They feel hot. They're confused. So they undress. Investigators and rescue workers who aren't familiar with this phenomenon have sometimes mistaken hypothermia victims for victims of sexual assault, finding bodies partially or completely undressed in the wilderness. It's a tragic misunderstanding of what was actually a physiological response to dying from cold. The second phenomenon is even stranger: terminal burrowing, sometimes called hide-and-die syndrome. German researchers who studied this behavior described it as an autonomous process triggered by the brain stem in the final stages of hypothermia. It produces what they called a primitive, burrowing-like behavior similar to what's seen in hibernating animals. Victims experiencing this will seek out small, enclosed spaces. They crawl under beds, behind wardrobes, into closets, under bushes, between rocks. Bodies have been found in positions that could only have been reached by crawling on hands and knees or dragging themselves flat on their stomachs, leaving abrasions on elbows and knees, but no corresponding damage to clothing, because the undressing had already happened. The researchers noted that in their cases, the final positions of the bodies often initially suggested that someone had tried to hide them. The reality was more heartbreaking. These were people in the absolute final moments of hypothermia, their conscious mind largely gone, operating on some ancient survival instinct that told them to find a small, protected space. This behavior occurs predominantly when temperature decreases slowly and in moderately cold conditions. Exactly the scenario George would have faced in the Bucegi Mountains in late November. Understanding these phenomena makes George's abandoned backpack more comprehensible, if no less tragic. If he was entering the later stages of hypothermia when he made that phone call, his judgment would have already been significantly impaired. The exhaustion he reported wasn't just physical fatigue, it was his body's thermoregulatory systems beginning to fail. If paradoxical undressing set in, he might have felt compelled to remove or leave behind items that felt burdensome or restrictive. In his confused state, the backpack might have seemed unnecessary or even uncomfortable. The sensation of heat from the peripheral vasodilation would have made heavy clothing feel unbearable. If terminal burrowing followed, he would have been driven by an instinct beyond conscious thought to find a small, enclosed space. A crevice between rocks, a hollow beneath tree roots, a depression in the terrain that offered the illusion of shelter. And once there, exhausted and hypothermic, he would have been virtually invisible to searchers, even if they passed within meters of his location. The timeline supports this grim reconstruction. George made his emergency call around 6 p.m. The sun had set. The temperature was dropping rapidly. He was already reporting symptoms of hypothermia and exhaustion. Within hours, not days, but hours, he could have progressed through the stages to the point where survival became impossible. Research on survival in cold conditions provides sobering statistics. A person experiencing severe hypothermia in sub-freezing temperatures, especially if wet or exhausted, may lose consciousness within 2 to 4 hours. Once unconscious, if not found and rewarmed, death typically follows within hours, not days. George had been in the mountains for at least 9 days before making that call. We don't know what his caloric intake had been during that time, or how well he'd been sleeping, or whether he'd stayed dry. But by the time he called for help, his reserves were already depleted. He was fighting hypothermia from a weakened baseline. The rescuers understood all of this. They knew the physiology. They knew the timeline. They knew that every hour that passed without finding George made it exponentially less likely they would find him alive. And they kept searching anyway. Through December, even as the official large-scale search operations were suspended due to the avalanche risk, patrols continued to monitor the area. Rescue teams would go out during weather windows, checking sections of the valley that had become accessible, following up on any new information that came in. They were searching not for a survivor at this point. They were searching for a body, for closure, for something to bring home to the family. George's mother, Jo Smyth, remained in Romania through much of this period. The anguish of not knowing, of having her son simply vanish into the mountains, was compounded by the impossibility of traditional grief. There was no body to bury, no final confirmation, just the growing, crushing certainty that George wasn't coming home, mixed with the irrational hope that somehow, against all odds, he might have survived. The family issued statements through the rescue service and the media, thanking the searchers for their efforts, asking for continued vigilance, holding on to whatever fragile hope they could maintain. But as December turned to January, and the snow in the Tăgănești Valley grew deeper, and the conditions remained brutal, that hope eroded day by day. The British Foreign Office was involved, coordinating with Romanian authorities, providing support to the family. The University of Bristol, where George had only just begun his studies, released statements expressing their support and sadness. Newport Salop Rugby Club, where George had played and coached, was devastated. These were people who had known him since he was a child, who had watched him grow up, who had seen his kindness and his enthusiasm and his loyalty to his teammates. On social media, the search for George became a rallying point. People across the UK and Romania shared his photograph, spread information about the search, offered prayers and condolences to the family. But none of it could change the fundamental reality. George Smyth was somewhere in the Bucegi Mountains, and the mountains weren't giving him back. In late January 2026, the family made the decision that no family should ever have to make. They accepted that George was gone. In a statement that captured the unbearable nature of grief without closure, they wrote, "After a long period of uncertainty and hope, we have now come to terms with the loss of our beloved George. Although we will continue to hope that George will eventually be found and brought home to us, we have to accept that he is lost to the mountains." They described George as a phenomenally kind, loyal and selfless young man with a limitless passion for all that he did. A sporty and strong young man who traveled extensively with his family and friends. They spoke of his boundless energy and his enthusiasm, his fairness and his dedication. The statement continued, "We are all immensely proud of all that George achieved during his short life, and his family and friends have been devastated by this tragedy. George was a valued part of the Colts section and a dedicated volunteer coach within the minis and juniors. His character showed through in all he did, and he was an example to all." Newport Salop Rugby Club released their own tribute, describing their immense grief as a club. "George has been a massive part of this club since a very young age, and has been an active player and coach throughout his time with us," they wrote. "The thoughts of all of the club are with George's family and friends at this time." It was the kind of tribute that gets written for someone lost too young, someone whose potential would never be realized, whose future had been stolen by circumstance and terrain and the unforgiving physics of hypothermia. The search, officially, remained open. Salvamont Brashov made it clear they had not abandoned the case. When weather and snow conditions improved, when it became safe to operate in the Tăgănești Valley again, they would resume searching. If new information came to light, they would respond immediately. If hikers in the area reported finding anything, belongings, signs, remains, the teams would investigate. But everyone understood the reality. The Bucegi Mountains are vast. The Tăgănești Valley alone covers a huge area, with countless ravines, rock formations, and depressions where a body could lie concealed. The winter snow, meters deep in places, would have covered any trace. Spring melt might reveal something, or it might not. Bodies have been lost in these mountains for years, sometimes decades, before being found. Some are never found at all. The question that haunts everyone who learns about George Smyth's disappearance is the simplest and most unanswerable. What exactly happened in those final hours? We know the basic facts. We know George was in the Tăgănești Valley on November 23rd. We know he passed the Maleesti chalet without stopping despite approaching darkness. We know he made an emergency call around 6 p.m. reporting hypothermia and exhaustion. We know his phone signal died shortly after. We know rescuers found his backpack within hours, still containing the equipment he needed to survive. But the space between those facts is where the mystery lives, and where speculation becomes both inevitable and ultimately futile. Let's walk through what we can reasonably reconstruct, based on the evidence, and what we understand about mountain accidents and hypothermia. George likely started his hike from Poiana Brashov that morning with a specific destination in mind. Based on the direction he was traveling and the route he took, he was probably heading toward the Bran area, planning to spend one or more nights camping in the mountains before continuing on. This wasn't completely reckless. People hike and camp in the Bucegi Mountains regularly, even in November, though it requires proper preparation and a healthy respect for how quickly conditions can deteriorate. The hike itself would have been strenuous, but manageable in good conditions. The trails in this area are well marked in most places, though they can become difficult to follow when snow begins to cover the ground or when fog reduces visibility. George was young and fit, a rugby player accustomed to physical exertion. Under normal circumstances, the physical demands of the hike wouldn't have been beyond his capabilities. But something began to go wrong, perhaps earlier than George realized. One possibility is that he underestimated the time required to reach his planned destination. This is a common mistake among hikers, especially those unfamiliar with mountain terrain. What looks like a straightforward distance on a map becomes much longer when you factor in elevation changes, rough terrain, and the need to navigate carefully. Hours can slip away faster than anticipated. If George started later than optimal, or if the hiking took longer than he expected, he might have found himself still moving when darkness began to fall. In the mountains, darkness doesn't arrive gradually like it does in cities or open country. The sun drops behind peaks and ridges, and suddenly you're in shadow, and then you're in darkness, and visibility plummets. This could explain why he passed the Malaiesti chalet without stopping. If he checked his map and thought he was close to his intended destination, if he believed he could push on for another hour or two and reach better shelter or a more scenic spot to camp, he might have made the calculated decision to keep moving. But in the mountains, calculated decisions can become fatal miscalculations very quickly. Another possibility is that the weather changed faster than George anticipated. Weather in the Carpathians is notoriously unpredictable, especially in the transition between autumn and winter. A day that starts clear and manageable can turn into a survival situation within hours. Fog can roll in and disorient even experienced hikers. Wind can pick up suddenly, cutting through clothing and stealing body heat. Snow can begin falling without warning. If George was caught in deteriorating weather while still some distance from shelter, he would have faced a difficult choice. Push on toward his destination in the hope of reaching it before conditions became truly dangerous, or stop where he was and try to set up his tent in increasingly hostile conditions. If he chose to push on, that decision would have cost him energy and body heat at an accelerating rate. Walking through snow, especially if it was accumulating, requires significantly more effort than walking on clear trail. The wind would have been stealing heat from his body faster than he could generate it through movement. If his clothes became damp from sweat or snow, the heat loss would have accelerated even more. At some point, we don't know when, but it must have happened, George crossed an invisible threshold. He went from being a tired hiker in difficult conditions to being a person in genuine medical danger. His core temperature began to drop into the range where hypothermia starts to affect judgment and physical capability. This is where things become truly dangerous, because the victim often doesn't realize what's happening to them. The confusion and impaired judgment are themselves symptoms of hypothermia, which means the person is losing the ability to recognize their own deterioration at the exact moment when clear thinking is most critical. George might have felt tired and thought he just needed to rest. He might have felt cold but believed it was manageable, that he could warm up once he stopped and set up camp. He might have looked at his map and convinced himself he was close to shelter, that it made sense to keep pushing for just a little longer. By the time he made that emergency call at 6 p.m., he was already reporting hypothermia and exhaustion. This suggests he had reached the point where he recognized, through the fog of impaired judgment, that he was in serious trouble. Making that call was probably the last fully rational decision he made. We don't know what the emergency dispatcher told him, but standard protocol in these situations is clear. Keep moving if you can, stay on marked trails, don't fall asleep, help is coming. George probably tried to follow those instructions. He probably tried to keep moving. But at some point after that call ended, something happened that caused George to leave his backpack behind. This is the detail that troubles everyone who studies the case. A backpack full of survival equipment isn't something you abandon unless you have a compelling reason, or unless your judgment has deteriorated to the point where you're no longer making rational decisions. One scenario is purely physical. George could have collapsed from exhaustion. If he fell and injured himself, a twisted ankle, a blow to the head from hitting a rock, damage to a knee or leg, he might have been unable to carry the backpack any further. He might have left it where it fell, intending to come back for it, and tried to continue without the weight. But if that were the case, you'd expect to find the pack near where he fell, with some sign of the accident. The rescuers found the pack, but no immediate evidence of a fall or injury in that specific location. The more likely explanation, given what we know about hypothermia, is that George's judgment had deteriorated to the point where the backpack seemed unnecessary or burdensome. In the grip of moderate to severe hypothermia, with confusion setting in and the bizarre sensation of heat from paradoxical vasodilation potentially beginning, he might have decided, in a way that made perfect sense to his impaired mind, to leave the pack behind. Maybe he thought he was close to shelter and didn't need it. Maybe the weight felt unbearable and he convinced himself he could move faster without it. Maybe the sensation of heat made him want to shed everything that felt heavy or restrictive. Once he left the backpack, his survival time compressed dramatically. Without shelter, without a sleeping bag, without the ability to create any barrier between himself and the cold, he was completely exposed. And he was likely already in the advanced stages of hypothermia. The terminal burrowing instinct might have kicked in next. If it did, George would have been driven by something beyond conscious thought to find a small, protected space. He would have been crawling, moving low to the ground, seeking out any depression or crevice that seemed to offer shelter. This is where the terrain of the Taiganesti Valley becomes crucial to understanding why George wasn't found. The valley is not a smooth, open space. It's broken up by countless ravines, rock formations, hollows beneath tree roots, spaces between boulders. There are spots where a person could fit into a gap that's invisible from even a few meters away. There are overhangs and undercuts and natural caves formed by the way the rocks have settled over millennia. If George crawled into one of these spaces in the grip of terminal burrowing behavior, he would have been nearly impossible to spot. The search dogs might not have been able to pick up his scent if the wind was wrong or if enough snow had fallen. The thermal cameras would only work if they were pointed at the exact right angle to see into the space where he'd sheltered. The human searchers could have walked within 10 meters and never seen him. And then the snow came. Meters of snow, accumulating day after day through December and January. Whatever space George had crawled into would have been completely sealed off, invisible from the surface. This is the most likely scenario. George, in the final stages of hypothermia, found a small protected space and crawled into it. He lost consciousness there. His heart rate and breathing slowed. His body temperature continued to drop. And at some point in the darkness, probably within hours of making that emergency call, his heart stopped beating. The snow buried him, and the mountains kept their secret. There's another question that deserves consideration, though it's less comfortable to confront. Could George have been saved? The answer is complicated and painful. From a purely logistical standpoint, the rescue response was as good as could reasonably be expected. The Salvamont Brasov service mobilized quickly. They deployed significant resources despite dangerous conditions. They searched through the night and continued searching for days. They brought in helicopters and drones and every piece of technology available to them. But George's phone signal died almost immediately after his call. Without that signal, without GPS coordinates, the searchers were working with an extremely broad search area. The Taiganesti Valley covers many square kilometers of extremely difficult terrain. Even with dozens of searchers and sophisticated equipment, you cannot search an area that large in a matter of hours, especially in darkness and deteriorating weather. If George's phone had maintained signal, if the rescuers could have gotten a precise location, if they could have reached him within an hour or two of his call, he might have survived. Severe hypothermia is survivable if the victim is found in time and properly rewarmed. People have been revived from core temperatures so low they had no detectable pulse. But none of those ifs came to pass. The phone died. The location was approximate at best. The terrain was vast, and the conditions were brutal. And George, in his hypothermic confusion, moved away from his backpack and into terrain where he couldn't be found. Could he have saved himself? Again, the answer is complicated by what we know about hypothermia and impaired judgment. If George had stopped at the Malaiesti chalet, he would almost certainly be alive today. That decision, made hours before his emergency call, was the crucial turning point. But we don't know what was going through his mind at that moment. Maybe he didn't realize the chalet was there. Maybe he thought he was close to his destination. Maybe he felt fine and didn't understand how quickly things could deteriorate. If he had set up his tent and gotten into his sleeping bag when he first started feeling seriously cold, before the hypothermia affected his judgment, he might have survived the night. His equipment was adequate for the conditions if used properly. But again, hypothermia impairs the very judgment needed to make these survival decisions. There's a cruel paradox. By the time you recognize you're in serious trouble, your ability to respond effectively has already been compromised. The truth is that mountain accidents like this often come down to a cascade of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, that combine to create a fatal outcome. George probably didn't make any single catastrophic mistake. He made a series of choices that seemed manageable in the moment, but left him with no margin for error when conditions changed. This is how the mountains kill people. Not through obvious recklessness or dramatic catastrophes, but through the slow accumulation of small miscalculations in an environment that punishes mistakes with death. The Bucegi Mountains have been claiming lives for as long as people have been venturing into them. George Smyth is far from the first person to disappear in these peaks, and he won't be the last. Understanding this larger context doesn't diminish the tragedy of his specific case, but it does help explain why what happened to him, while heartbreaking, wasn't particularly unusual. The Southern Carpathians have a documented history of mountain accidents stretching back over a century. The records kept by Salvamont and earlier rescue organizations tell a consistent story. The mountains are beautiful, accessible, and deceptively dangerous. The combination draws people in, and a percentage of those people never come back out. The statistics are sobering. In an average year, the various Salvamont services across Romania respond to hundreds of mountain rescue calls. Many of these are relatively minor incidents: twisted ankles, mild altitude sickness, people who've become temporarily lost but are found quickly. But every year, there are also the serious cases: the falls from cliffs, the avalanche victims, the hypothermia deaths. November and December are particularly dangerous months. The conditions are in transition between autumn hiking season and full winter mountaineering season. The weather is unpredictable in ways it isn't during the more stable summer or the consistently harsh deep winter. Snow accumulation is irregular, enough to create serious hazards, but not enough to close trails completely or discourage hikers who think they can handle it. Solo hikers are at particular risk. The statistics bear this out clearly. When something goes wrong in the mountains, having even one other person with you dramatically increases survival chances. They can provide warmth, make the emergency call while you conserve energy, help with navigation if you become disoriented, make you visible to searchers. Solo hikers have none of these safeguards. The Bucegi Mountains specifically have several characteristics that make them more dangerous than their relatively modest altitude might suggest. At just over 2,500 meters at the highest peaks, they're not competing with the Alps or the Himalayas for sheer elevation. But elevation isn't the only factor that kills people in mountains. The weather systems in the Carpathians can change with startling speed. A weather front can move through in hours, bringing snow, wind, and fog that transform benign terrain into a survival situation. The mountains create their own microclimates, with conditions at the peaks radically different from conditions in the valleys. A hiker starting out in sunshine can be fighting for survival in a blizzard 6 hours later. The terrain is complex in ways that aren't immediately obvious from the trail. What looks like a straightforward path can branch into dozens of smaller tracks, some maintained, some created by animals or previous hikers wandering off-route. In good visibility, these false trails are easy to identify and avoid. In fog or snow, they can lead you miles off course before you realize the mistake. The forests are thick and disorienting. The valleys are carved with countless ravines and gullies. The rock formations create natural traps, overhangs that look stable but aren't, slopes that seem gentle until you're committed and realize they're steeper than they appeared, ground that looks solid but is actually covered with a thin layer of snow over loose scree. And the mobile phone coverage is patchy at best. In the valleys, you might have signal. On the peaks, you might have signal. But in the transition zones, in the complex terrain where most accidents happen, coverage is unreliable. A phone that works perfectly in one location might have no signal 50 meters away. All of these factors conspired against George Smyth. But they conspire against dozens of people every year in these mountains. What makes George's case particularly poignant is how preventable it was. This wasn't a case of extreme mountaineering gone wrong. George wasn't attempting a technical climb or pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the mountains. He was hiking on marked trails with adequate equipment. Under different circumstances, if he'd started earlier, if he'd stopped at the chalet, if the weather had held, if his phone had maintained signal, he would have completed his hike and gone home with stories and photographs. The margin between that outcome and what actually happened was razor thin. This is the uncomfortable truth about mountain safety. You can do everything reasonably right and still die. You can make 99 good decisions and one questionable decision, and the mountains will punish that one questionable decision with death. The environment is unforgiving in the truest sense of the word. It doesn't make allowances for inexperience or youth or good intentions. Since George's disappearance, the case has become part of the growing conversation about solo hiking safety, particularly among young people. The accessibility of mountain areas and the rise of social media have created a complicated dynamic. Beautiful photographs of mountain landscapes inspire people to seek out those same locations, but photographs don't convey the danger. They don't show the cold or the wind or the disorientation that fog brings. They don't capture the speed at which hypothermia can steal your judgment and your life. There's also been discussion in hiking and mountaineering communities about the responsibility of more experienced hikers to educate newcomers. The internet has made it easy to research trails and plan hikes, but it's also made it easy to overestimate your abilities. Reading about a trail online and actually hiking it are vastly different experiences. George had done some hiking before his trip to Romania. He wasn't completely inexperienced. But there's a difference between hiking in the UK, where rescue services are highly developed and the climate is relatively mild, and hiking in the Carpathians in late November, where conditions can turn deadly with little warning and rescue is complicated by terrain and distance. The question of whether George fully understood this difference is unanswerable now. What we can say is that many young hikers don't fully appreciate the additional risks that come with solo hiking in unfamiliar terrain in shoulder season conditions. The outdoor education community has tried to distill these lessons into simple guidelines that can save lives. The advice isn't complicated, but it's often ignored by people who feel confident or invincible or who simply don't believe that anything bad will happen to them. Tell someone where you're going. Not just that you're hiking in Romania, but the specific trail, the planned route, the expected return time. George's family didn't know he was in the mountains until he was already missing. If they'd known his intended route, the search area could have been narrowed immediately, potentially by hours or even days. Carry communication devices. A mobile phone is better than nothing, but coverage is unreliable in mountains. Personal locator beacons or satellite messengers like inReach devices work anywhere and can send precise GPS coordinates even when phone coverage is non-existent. These devices cost a few $100s, far less than a funeral. Check weather forecasts obsessively, and have a plan B if conditions deteriorate. The weather George experienced wasn't a freak occurrence. It was normal November weather in the Carpathians. If he'd checked the forecast and understood what those conditions meant for hiking, he might have postponed or modified his plans. Know your limits and be willing to turn back. This is perhaps the hardest advice to follow because it requires admitting that you've made a mistake or overestimated your abilities. Summit fever, the compelling desire to reach your goal, even when conditions suggest you shouldn't, kills people regularly in mountains. George passed a warm, safe chalet and continued into increasingly difficult terrain. We don't know why he made that choice, but turning back or stopping at the chalet would have saved his life. Carry the right equipment and know how to use it. George had a tent and sleeping bag, but did he know how to set up the tent quickly in high wind? Had he practiced? There's a world of difference between setting up a tent in your backyard on a calm summer evening and trying to pitch it on a mountainside in a snowstorm with frozen fingers and impaired judgment. Start early and build in margin for error. Mountain days are short in November. Darkness comes early. If your planned hike requires every available hour of daylight, you have no buffer if anything goes wrong. Starting an hour late, taking a wrong turn, dealing with more difficult terrain than expected, any of these can put you in the position of hiking in darkness, which dramatically increases risk. These guidelines sound obvious when you read them in a comfortable room. But in the moment, with adrenaline and excitement and the confidence of youth, they're easy to ignore or rationalize away. George probably didn't think he was taking unreasonable risks. He probably felt capable and prepared. And in different circumstances, he would have been right. The problem with mountains is that they reveal the difference between adequate preparation and perfect preparation with fatal efficiency. The search for George Smyth, while officially suspended during the dangerous winter months, never truly stopped. The family maintained contact with Romanian authorities. The Salvament service kept the case active in their systems. Hikers in the area were reminded to watch for any signs or belongings. The hope, increasingly faint but never entirely extinguished, was that the spring melt would reveal something. In mountain disappearances, this waiting period is its own form of torture for families. The not knowing is worse in some ways than confirmed death. Without a body, there's no closure, no funeral that brings finality, no grave to visit. Just the knowledge that somewhere in all that rock and snow, your loved one is lying alone. Jo Smyth and her family faced this unbearable limbo for months. The initial period of active searching gave way to the suspended operations of winter, which gave way to the painful waiting for spring. Through it all, they held on to the hope that George would be found and brought home, even as they intellectually accepted that he wasn't coming home alive. The community support, both in the UK and Romania, was significant. The rugby club where George had played and coached rallied around the family. Friends organized fundraisers to help cover the costs of travel to Romania and the extended search operations. The University of Bristol provided whatever support they could to a family grieving a student who had barely begun his time there. But community support, however well-intentioned, can't fill the specific hole left by a missing child. It can't answer the questions that haunt parents in the dark hours. Did he suffer? Was he afraid? Did he think of us in those final moments? Could we have prevented this? These questions are made worse by the fact that they're unanswerable. The last person to hear George's voice was the emergency dispatcher. Everything after that phone call is speculation and reconstruction based on the evidence of an abandoned backpack and the science of hypothermia. By January 2026, more than 2 months after George's disappearance, the family reached the decision point that comes in all cases like this. They could continue waiting, holding on to increasingly implausible hope, keeping themselves in suspended animation between grief and denial. Or they could accept the reality that the evidence overwhelmingly supported, begin the grieving process, and try to find some way forward. They chose acceptance, not because hope had been completely extinguished, but because living in that state of suspension was unsustainable. Their statement, released in late January, acknowledged both the reality of their loss and the continuing hope that George would eventually be found and brought home to them. It was a document that captured the impossible position they found themselves in, knowing their son was gone, but having no body to bury, no physical confirmation to make the loss feel complete. The tributes that followed, from the rugby club, from friends, from the university, painted a picture of a young man whose life had touched many people in his 18 years. The consistency of the descriptions was striking. Phenomenally kind, loyal, selfless, energetic, enthusiastic, fair, dedicated. These weren't generic platitudes, the kind of nice things people say about anyone who dies young. They were specific characterizations repeated by multiple sources who had known George in different contexts. His coaches saw the same qualities as his teammates, who saw the same qualities as the younger players he mentored. He was, by all accounts, someone who made the world around him better. Someone whose death wasn't just a loss to his immediate family, but to his broader community. Someone whose potential would never be realized, whose impact on the world was cut short before it had really begun. The question of what happens next in cases like George's is complicated by the nature of the terrain and the realities of mountain recovery operations. In urban settings, when someone dies, the body is recovered relatively quickly. The processes of death investigation, autopsy if necessary, and burial or cremation follow a predictable timeline. Families can plan funerals, hold memorial services, begin the grieving process with the physical certainty that their loved one is truly gone. Mountain deaths don't follow this script. Bodies lost in remote mountain terrain can remain unfound for years, sometimes decades. The Carpathians alone have dozens of unsolved disappearances stretching back through the decades, cases where hikers or climbers vanished and were never found despite extensive searches. There are several reasons why mountain recovery is so difficult, even when searchers have a general idea of where to look. The first is simply the scale of the terrain. The Tyganesti Valley, where George's backpack was found, isn't a small area that can be systematically searched meter by meter. It's a vast wilderness of forests, ravines, rock formations, and complex topography. Even with modern technology, even with dozens of searchers, you cannot examine every square meter of terrain in such an area. The searchers focus on likely areas, along trails, near water sources, and natural shelters. But a body could be in any of thousands of spots that searchers never check because they're too remote, too dangerous to access, or simply overlooked in the vastness. The second factor is concealment. If George did experience terminal burrowing and crawled into a small enclosed space, he would be incredibly difficult to spot even if searchers passed nearby. A body wedged between rocks, beneath an overhang, or in a natural depression can be invisible from just meters away. The mountain rescue teams know this. They've found bodies before in locations that have been searched multiple times, finally discovered when the light hit at just the right angle or when someone happened to look in exactly the right spot. The third factor is snow. The accumulation of meters of snow through the winter doesn't just cover a body. It can fundamentally alter the landscape. What was visible terrain in November becomes buried under snow in January. Depressions fill in. Rock formations become rounded white mounds. The entire topography changes, and with it, the visibility of anything beneath the snow. When spring comes and the snow begins to melt, it doesn't reveal everything at once. The melt happens gradually, over weeks or months. It happens at different rates depending on elevation, sun exposure, and microclimate. A body in a north-facing ravine that doesn't get much sun might remain snow-covered weeks after south-facing slopes have cleared. A body beneath an overhang or in a deep depression might not be exposed until late spring or even early summer. And even then, exposure doesn't guarantee discovery. A body that's been buried under snow for months, exposed to freeze-thaw cycles, possibly scavenged by wildlife, becomes increasingly difficult to recognize as human remains. From a distance, it might look like debris or dead wood, or just another feature of the rocky landscape. This is the grim reality the Salvamont teams face in cases like George's. They know roughly where to search. They have the area where his backpack was found as a starting point. But roughly where to search in mountain terrain can still mean dozens of square kilometers of extremely difficult and dangerous ground. The teams have committed to resuming the search when conditions allow. This isn't just empty words meant to comfort the family. Mountain rescue services take these commitments seriously. The searchers understand that finding George and bringing him home matters, both for the closure it would provide his family and for the simple human dignity of not leaving someone to rot alone in the wilderness. But they also have to balance that commitment against the safety of their own teams. Searching in avalanche conditions isn't brave, it's suicidal. Sending rescuers into terrain where they're likely to become victims themselves doesn't help anyone. The decision to suspend the search during the winter wasn't abandonment. It was a recognition that some risks are unacceptable even in the service of recovery operations. As winter begins to transition toward spring, the Salvamont teams will be monitoring conditions in the Tyganesti Valley. They'll be watching the snow depth, the avalanche risk, the weather patterns. When they determine it's safe enough to operate, they'll go back in. They might find George quickly. Spring melt has revealed bodies within days of searches resuming. The snow recedes, something that looks wrong catches a searcher's eye, and there's the closure everyone has been waiting for. Or they might search for weeks and find nothing. The body might be in a location that remains snow-covered even after most of the valley is cleared. It might be in a spot that's too dangerous to access safely. It might have been moved by animals or by the forces of freeze and thaw. Or, and this is the possibility that haunts everyone involved in these cases, George might never be found at all. The mountains are vast. The terrain is complex. Nature is efficient at concealing what it claims. People have disappeared in the Carpathians before, and their bodies have never been recovered, despite years of searching, despite the best efforts of professional rescue teams, despite families who never gave up hope. This is simply the reality of mountain accidents in remote terrain. Sometimes the mountains give back their dead. Sometimes they don't. For other families facing similar situations, and tragically, there will be other families. George's case offers both lessons and a kind of terrible roadmap. The immediate response when someone goes missing in the mountains is crucial. The first hours matter more than anything else. If you're planning to hike in remote areas, having a concrete plan that someone else knows about can cut hours or even days off the search time. Those hours can be the difference between life and death in hypothermia cases. The technology exists to prevent situations like George's. Personal locator beacons send distress signals via satellite with precise GPS coordinates. They work anywhere in the world, regardless of cell phone coverage. They're not prohibitively expensive, several $100s for a device that could save your life. Satellite messengers like Garmin inReach allow two-way communication even in areas with no cell coverage. You can send your location to family or friends at regular intervals. You can message for help if needed. You can receive weather updates. The subscription cost is modest compared to the value of the safety they provide. These technologies aren't perfect. They require batteries, which can fail in extreme cold. They require the user to activate them, which means you need to recognize you're in trouble before it's too late. But they dramatically increase survival chances in exactly the kind of situation George found himself in. The resistance to carrying this equipment often comes down to a combination of cost concerns, weight considerations, and a fundamental belief that it won't happen to me. Young hikers especially tend to feel invincible, to believe that serious accidents happen to other people, to the unprepared or the unlucky, but not to them. George Smyth probably felt this way too. He was young, fit, confident. He had hiking experience. He had adequate equipment. He probably didn't think he was taking unreasonable risks. And yet here we are, discussing his death and the ongoing search for his body. The lesson isn't that mountains should be avoided or that hiking is too dangerous. Mountains are valuable. They offer experiences and perspectives that can't be found anywhere else. The challenge and beauty of mountain environments draw people for good reasons. The lesson is that mountains demand respect, preparation, and humility. They demand acknowledgement that you are small and fragile, and that the environment doesn't care about your intentions or your potential. They demand that you build in safety margins, that you have backup plans, that you're willing to turn back when conditions deteriorate. Most importantly, mountains demand that you communicate. Tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. Check in when possible. Make yourself findable if something goes wrong. George didn't do these things, and it cost him his life. That's not a moral judgment. It's not blaming the victim. It's a simple statement of cause and effect. If his family had known his specific location and route, if he'd carried a satellite messenger that could have sent his exact coordinates, if he'd had a backup plan that involved stopping at the chalet when darkness fell, he would likely be alive today. These aren't abstract hypotheticals. They're concrete, achievable safety measures that would have changed the outcome. The broader conversation around mountain safety has intensified in recent years as social media has made mountain landscapes more visible and more accessible. Instagram and TikTok are filled with stunning images of people in beautiful mountain settings. These images inspire others to seek out similar experiences, which is both wonderful and concerning. Wonderful because mountains have value beyond the purely utilitarian. They offer perspective, challenge, beauty, and the kind of experiences that stay with you for life. Getting more people into mountain environments can foster appreciation for wild places and build constituencies that support conservation. Concerning because the images don't show the full picture. They don't show the hours of slog to reach that perfect viewpoint. They don't show the careful planning and preparation. They don't show the times when weather forced a turn-back decision. They don't show the close calls that didn't become disasters because the hiker had backup plans and safety equipment. The result is a generation of hikers who may be inspired by beautiful images but don't fully understand the knowledge and preparation behind them, who see the destination but not the journey, who underestimate the gap between their current skill level and what's required to safely reach those Instagram-worthy locations. The outdoor industry has tried to address this through education, through promoting courses and certifications, through emphasizing that responsible recreation requires learning and preparation. But education competes with impulse, and in the age of instant gratification, it often loses. George's death won't change this dynamic by itself, but it can serve as a data point, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the mountains are beautiful and inspiring and also dangerous. That the gap between a successful hike and a fatal accident can be small and can close faster than you might expect. If George's story causes even one person to reconsider a risky decision, to invest in safety equipment, to take an extra day to prepare properly, then something meaningful will have come from this tragedy. It won't bring George back. It won't ease his family's grief. But it might prevent another family from experiencing the same loss. That's the only redemption available in cases like this. Not meaning or purpose. Death doesn't need to mean anything, but the possibility that the lesson learned might save someone else. As we approach the end of George's story, or rather, the end of what can be told about it, it's worth stepping back to consider what this case reveals about the relationship between humans and wild places. Mountains have always occupied a unique space in human consciousness. They're simultaneously attractive and repelling, beautiful and terrifying, places of transcendence and danger. For thousands of years, humans avoided mountains when possible. They were obstacles to travel, homes to dangerous animals, sources of avalanches and rockfall. The people who lived in mountain regions did so out of necessity, not choice, and they treated the peaks with wary respect. The shift toward recreational mountaineering is relatively recent in human history. The idea that someone would climb a mountain for pleasure, for the challenge, for the views, is largely a product of the Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. Before that, climbing mountains was seen as somewhere between pointless and insane. But once the idea took hold, it spread rapidly. Mountains became places to test yourself, to escape the constraints of civilized life, to experience something raw and authentic. Alpinism became a sport. Mountain tourism became an industry, and people started dying in mountains not because they had to cross them, but because they chose to. This shift brought with it a complicated ethical question that we're still wrestling with today. What is the responsibility of society toward people who choose to put themselves in danger? When George Smyth went into the Bucegi Mountains alone in November, he made a choice. He wasn't compelled to go. He wasn't fleeing danger or seeking necessary resources. He went because he wanted to, because mountains called to something in him, because he was young and adventurous and wanted to test himself against wild terrain. When that choice went catastrophically wrong, Romanian mountain rescue services responded with everything they had. Dozens of professionals put their own safety at risk to search for George in brutal conditions. Helicopters were deployed at significant expense. The search continued for days despite the danger to the searchers. This response is appropriate and admirable. Mountain rescue services exist precisely because we've collectively decided that people who get into trouble in the mountains deserve help, regardless of whether they made mistakes or took risks. The alternative, leaving people to die because they made poor choices, is morally unacceptable to most modern societies. But this creates a complicated dynamic. If rescue services will respond when things go wrong, does that create a moral hazard where people take greater risks than they otherwise would? Are we subsidizing dangerous behavior by promising to rescue people when their adventures go badly? The answer to these questions varies depending on who you ask. Some mountain rescue organizations have begun charging for rescue operations in certain circumstances, particularly when the person being rescued made egregiously poor decisions or ignored warnings. The logic is that if you choose to take unreasonable risks, you should bear the financial consequences when those risks materialize. Others argue that charging for rescues creates perverse incentives. People might delay calling for help because they're worried about the cost, turning a manageable situation into a fatal one. Mountain rescue, in this view, should be like firefighting, a public service provided without charge because the alternative creates worse outcomes. George's case doesn't provide clear answers to these questions. He took risks, certainly, but were they unreasonable risks? He was hiking on marked trails with appropriate equipment. He wasn't attempting anything extreme. The margin between his hike being a success and being a tragedy was smaller than you might think. Should he have told his family where he was going? Absolutely. Should he have carried better communication equipment? Yes. Should he have stopped at the chalet when darkness was approaching? Without question. But these are errors in judgment, not recklessness. And regardless of the choices George made, once he called for help, the response was appropriate. The Salvamont teams didn't ask whether he'd made mistakes before they mobilized. They didn't calculate whether he deserved rescue. They simply responded because someone needed help in the mountains. This is how it should be. The time to discuss risk and responsibility is before people go into the mountains, through education and preparation. Once someone is in trouble, the only question is how to help them. The impact of George's death extends far beyond the immediate family, though their loss is the most acute. His rugby club lost not just a player but a volunteer coach, someone who was giving back to younger players and helping build the next generation. Those younger players lost a role model and mentor. His teammates lost a friend and someone they'd grown up with. The club itself lost part of its identity and continuity. The University of Bristol lost a student who had barely begun his studies. His potential contributions to his field, whatever they might have been, are gone. His classmates lost someone they were just getting to know. The university community as a whole experienced the particular kind of grief that comes when someone so young dies in circumstances that seem preventable. The broader hiking and mountaineering community gained a cautionary tale, a reminder that the mountains don't care about your age or fitness or good intentions. George's story has been discussed in hiking forums, in mountain safety courses, in conversations between parents and children planning outdoor adventures. And the people of Newport, the community where George grew up, lost one of their own. In small towns, deaths like this reverberate through the entire social fabric. Everyone knows someone who knew George. The grief is shared across the community in a way that's both comforting and overwhelming. For Joe Smyth and her family, the grief will never fully heal. The specific pain of losing a child is its own category of suffering, beyond the normal bounds of human grief. The fact that George's body hasn't been recovered adds another layer of anguish. There's no grave to visit, no physical place to focus the grief, no ritual burial to mark the transition from life to death. They live now in a state of provisional acceptance. They've acknowledged that George is gone while still hoping he'll be found. They've begun grieving while maintaining the hope for closure. It's an impossible position, psychologically exhausting, a form of suffering that's difficult for people who haven't experienced it to fully understand. And yet they continue. They've released statements. They've cooperated with authorities. They've accepted condolences and tributes. They've somehow found the strength to function while carrying an unbearable weight. This is what families do when someone they love is lost to the mountains. They endure. They wait. They hope. And slowly, painfully, they begin to rebuild their lives around a hole that will never be filled. The search for George will resume when conditions allow. Exactly when that will be depends on weather patterns, snow melt, and avalanche risk assessments that won't be finalized until spring is well underway. The Salvamont teams will go back into the Taiganesti Valley. They'll focus on the area where George's backpack was found, expanding their search radius from that point. They'll check ravines and rock formations, places where a body might have been concealed by snow or terrain. They might find him quickly. The spring melt could reveal remains that have been snow-covered for months, and experienced searchers know what to look for. Bodies have been found in the Carpathians after similar delays, sometimes in locations that had been searched before but where snow or lighting conditions had prevented discovery. Or the search might continue for weeks without success. The terrain is vast. The possible locations are numerous, and a body that's been in the mountains for months can be remarkably difficult to spot even when you're actively looking for it. Or George might never be found. This is the outcome no one wants to consider, but that everyone involved must acknowledge as possible. The mountains are good at keeping secrets. They've held on to others before George and will hold on to others after. If George is found, his family will finally have the closure they've been waiting for. They'll be able to bring him home, hold a proper funeral, have a grave to visit. The uncertainty will end, replaced by the painful but necessary certainty of death. If he's not found, the family will have to learn to live with unresolved grief. They'll have to find a way to move forward without the closure that a body and a burial provide. They'll have to accept that somewhere in those mountains, George remains, and that might be as close to an answer as they'll ever get. Either way, life will continue. Joe Smyth will wake up each morning to a world without her son. The rugby club will play matches without George on the team or the sidelines. The University of Bristol will educate new classes of students who never knew him. The Bucegi Mountains will continue to attract hikers and climbers, some of whom will make mistakes similar to George's, some of whom will be luckier. This is the nature of tragedy. It doesn't pause the world. It doesn't change the fundamental rhythms of life. It simply removes someone from those rhythms and leaves the people who love them to figure out how to continue without them. If there's anything redemptive to take from George Smyth's story, it's in the lessons it offers to others who venture into wild places. The mountains are beautiful. They're worth experiencing. The sense of accomplishment from reaching a summit, the perspective that comes from seeing the world from elevation, the peace found in wild places far from civilization. These are real and valuable things. We shouldn't stop going into the mountains because sometimes people die there. But we should go prepared. We should go with knowledge and equipment and backup plans. We should tell people where we're going and when we expect to return. We should check weather forecasts and be willing to turn back when conditions deteriorate. We should carry communication devices that work when cell phones don't. We should build margins for error into our plans because mountains don't allow for mistakes. Most importantly, we should go with humility. The mountains don't care about your confidence or your fitness or how many Instagram followers you have. They operate according to physics and weather and probability, and they will kill you if you give them the opportunity. George Smyth was phenomenally kind, loyal, selfless, energetic, enthusiastic, fair, and dedicated. He was loved by his family and friends. He had a bright future ahead of him, and none of that mattered to the mountains. They took him anyway, not out of malice but out of indifference, because that's what mountains do. His story is a reminder that wild places are genuinely wild, that nature is not a theme park designed for our entertainment, that the outdoors can kill you as easily as it can inspire you. It's a reminder to respect the environment, to prepare properly, to make smart decisions even when those decisions feel overly cautious. If you're planning to hike in remote areas, especially alone, especially in shoulder season conditions, please learn from George's story. Take the extra precautions. Invest in the safety equipment. Tell someone your plans. Be willing to turn back. Build in margins for error. Your life is worth more than any summit, any photograph, any sense of accomplishment. The mountains will still be there tomorrow. They'll be there next year. There's no rush. There's no pressure. And there's no shame in choosing safety over ambition. George's family would give anything to have him back. They would trade every mountain vista in the world, every adventure, every moment of challenge and triumph, just to have their son alive and safe at home. That's not a trade they'll ever get to make. But it's a trade you can make. Every time you plan a hike, every time you check the weather, every time you decide whether to push on or turn back. Make the smart choice. Choose safety. Come home. The mountains will always be there, ancient and patient and indifferent. But you only get one life, and the people who love you only get one you. George Smyth learned this lesson too late. You don't have to. Somewhere in the Bucegi Mountains, in the vast wilderness of the Tiganesti Valley, beneath snow that has accumulated through months of winter, George Smyth remains. The mountains that drew him to Romania, that called to his sense of adventure, that promised challenge and beauty, have claimed him. When spring comes and the snow melts, perhaps he'll be found. Perhaps he'll be brought home to the family and community that loved him. Perhaps he'll have a proper burial, and his family will have the closure they desperately need. Or perhaps he'll remain hidden, another name in the long list of people who went into the mountains and never came out, whose final resting places are known only to the rocks and the snow and the indifferent peaks. Either way, his story matters. His life mattered. And the lessons of his death matter, if we choose to learn them. The mountains remember. They always remember. They just don't care. And that, in the end, is the most important lesson of all. If you've found value in George's story, if it's made you think about your own safety in wild places, if it's reminded you to tell someone where you're going before your next hike, please consider liking this video and sharing it with others who might benefit from these lessons. Subscribe to the channel for more stories told with respect and care. And most importantly, take care of yourself out there. The wilderness is beautiful and valuable and worth experiencing, but it's also dangerous, and it deserves your respect. George Smyth was 18 years old. He was loved. He is missed. And his memory deserves to be honored not just with words, but with the choices we make when we venture into wild places ourselves. Be safe. Be prepared. Come home.